No, Clancy is not the character name of a grandmother or of a kid who gets beat up at school. Clancy is the name of a rebellious and articulate cryptic character who seems very vital to 21 Pilots' lore in connection with their new album Trench. This might be the first time that you're hearing of Clancy if you haven't looked deeper into the story of Dima and Trench in 21 Pilots music, since Clancy was not mentioned in the album Trench, as Tyler made very clear in the first and probably last interview where he was asked about Clancy.
Is Clancy a more sort of opposite to Blurryface, a more positive, happy side to this tale? The new character and the new direction?
Interview number 1, man. I don't know. How did you know about Clancy?
Well, we had to listen to the album. We got a copy, so we've had to listen to the whole album.
Right, but Clancy's not on the record.
It's online. I've read about it.
Read about Clancy
and so on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. Clancy's. I've heard about him, but I don't. I know we're from the same place.
Got you. Okay.
So basically, Clancy is a character on 21 Pilots' cryptic site dmorg.info /found 3.1459 Clancy, whatever the site link is. We have seen this character thus far through different journal entries they has written, most of these coming during the end of the hiatus. Many people call these Clancy letters, but I wish we'd call them entries or journal entries, because it says on the very first journal entry right there that it's Clancy's journal, not letters to someone, but whatever. On this site, Clancy is trapped in Dima and seems to be critical of Dima's ways and wants to rebel and escape. Eventually he does in a photo that is labeled out, which has the in real life Dima in the back of the photo. For a long time, people were theorizing whether or not Clancy represented Tyler, Josh, or the Clique, with a few other theories, but these were the main 3. All 3 of these were debunked, however, in one single journal entry of Clancy's that described the Jumpsuit music video a week after it was released. Clancy described watching Tyler, which debunked the Clique's theory that was that Clancy was Tyler, which is probably the main theory, which makes sense since Tyler wrote the journal entries in real life, it seems. It also described seeing the Banditos and this being the first time that he has, confirming that he is not Josh, and the Banditos represent the Clique, so Clancy does not represent the Clique either. So who the fuck is Clancy? Well, that's why I'm making this video. First, I want to say that I do not believe that Clancy represents a person. If we look at the characters that 21 Pilots have made in the past, we will find that these characters are more so metaphorical representations of something rather than a specific person. Blurryface, for example, is a manifestation of Tyler's insecurities. Ned represents the creative process, or in Tyler's words while speaking of VK, it really represents this idea of creativity and trying to take care of it and trying to please it or appease it. So judging from these characters would make more sense to me, judging on how they seem to like making characters, that Clancy is a metaphor for something rather than representation of a person that exists. So okay, who is Clancy? What do I think that Clancy represents? This may be a little surprising, but I think that Clancy represents the music that the boys create. Clancy represents 21 Pilots music. Why do I think this? I have many reasons which I will lay down for you guys. Let's start with the very first line in the first Clancy entry. In this journal entry, Clancy starts out with the line, "The perplexities of the Dima horizon didn't occur to me until my 9th year." So this is Clancy's 9th year in Dima. This is the very first line ever said, so it seems like 9th year could be important. 2018, when this Clancy entry was released, was the 9th year that 21 Pilots had been around. So of course, Clancy doesn't represent Tyler or Josh, so I don't think that Clancy represents the band, but I think that Clancy represents the music once again, and I think that 9th year could be a hint towards that, as it was the 9th year of the music. Moving on to Clancy's second journal entry, Clancy says some things here that I find very interesting with this theory. This entry, in my opinion, makes so much sense reading it with Clancy representing the boys' music. So let's go through this. To refer to Dima as my home has never felt accurate. Dima to me has simply been the place that I've existed or the slot they've put me in. Okay, so the slot is a reference to the silence in car radio, which is being represented by the Towers of Silence, another name for Dima, because in Levitate Tyler says, "I got back what I once bought back and that slot I won't need to replace," which is a reference to car radio, and of course both use the word slot, so Clancy was forced to go into the Towers of Silence basically. Breaking away from the meaning of the journal entry real quick, I want to say that Tyler has said that Dima represents a place where you do not want to be and trying to get out of it and find a better place, being calm between two places. So there is a fair point that one can make that could be strange for Clancy to represent music being stuck in the Towers of Silence, when for Tyler, Dima represents mental struggle, religious questioning, etc. But personally, I find that Dima could represent something different for Clancy, but still remain the same place down to its basic concepts. So the Towers of Silence for Clancy could be being stuck in this sort of writing block, or not even necessarily writing block, but simply not being done with the music yet, which also makes sense with the name Towers of Silence, and the silence from the band when the boys are still making music and haven't released it yet. So it may be easier to just stay in this creative block, but it's a worse place than to release music and stuff like that. In the similar way that for Tyler, it may be easier to just stay in the same mental struggles instead of trying to combat them and escape, but it's a worse place. Sorry for dragging on this point, but the first Clancy journal entry also makes sense the idea that Tyler was struggling to create this and sort of in a writing block, also as mentioned in Pet Cheetah. As a child, I looked upon Dima with wonder. Today I'm wrought with frustration, as I spend each day squinting for a glimpse of the top of the looming wall that has kept us here, and I'm just gonna keep the way that I mispronounced frustration in this video. And Clancy talks about how things used to be easier and how tasks were completed easier, which I believe is referring to the boys creating the music that I believe that Clancy represents. Moving on to the next lines. I've heard stories about the idea of home, and its depiction has always seemed warm from the storyteller's description. There is a realistic ownership of the place they inhabited that I admired but could never relate to. The idea of home to Clancy seems related to storytelling. Okay, this seems very related to music and lyrics. I don't know how this could relate to anything else. Clancy seems to not be able to relate to the music that other people create. These journal entries are very cryptic and can be read with many different theories and sound correct, which is amazing by the boys, but this journal entry in my opinion seems to make very little sense with anything but their music. Let's continue. This place, my place however, seems devoid of the romance and wonder that the old stories tell. But somewhere between the Iron Order and infallible presence of Dima, a hum of wonder exists. It's the quiet wonder that my mind tends to get lost in. So Clancy talks about his home, his place here. So it seems that Clancy is trying to escape from Dima to another place of his, and in this place he mentions that's devoid of romance and wonder that the old stories tell. Romance and wonder of old stories. This is pretty vague, and I could see how somebody could argue that this is a reach, but I think that the old stories that he is referring to is self-titled, as maybe even a direct response to something he said before the hiatus started, which is that he wants to go back to the fearless songwriting of self-titled, and this is saying that this album may not be quite that. He says that, however, he found something between the Iron Order and infallible presses of Dima, which sounds like a lot of big, not understandable words, but infallible presses roughly means text that can't be wrong, which I think is basically a callback to him saying fearless songwriting of self-titled. I think that the Iron Order is a call to the rest of the industry being very black and white. So I think he means that Trench is basically somewhere between self-titled and this robotic sort of mainstream music, which I think would be an apt description. The next line is one of my biggest pieces of proof that Clancy represents the music. This hope discovery alone has birthed a new version of myself, a better version. I hope that I'll find a way to experience what's beyond these colossal walls. A new version of myself. I think that this is him referring to the change the music. Especially if I'm correct about what those previous lines mean, this makes total sense to mean that this has made a new version of the music. It just all makes way too much sense. At the end he speaks about experiencing beyond the walls of Dima, such as Clancy did in the first entry as well. This brings me to another point in terms of leaving Dima. Think about it. Throughout the end of the hiatus, Clancy wrote journal entries about escaping Dima, and then once he finally got out and got to Trench, the boys broke the silence and the new music was released. Is it really coincidence that Dima is named Towers of Silence, and a big part of the hiatus was it being a silence from the boys, and now I just send silence being their last message? I mean, the link to Dima.org was even right after the end of Car Radio, after Tyler says, and now I just sit in silence. So what am I trying to get at? Once Clancy left the Towers of Silence, the hiatus ended. Once Clancy left Silence, the silence ended. And so basically Clancy leaving Dima was when the new music was released. And I don't think that this is a coincidence by any means, or two disconnected factors being connected just in order to release the music or anything like that. I think that Clancy represents the music, and him leaving the Towers of Silence was connected to them breaking the silence and finally putting out the music. So in other words, Clancy was released, and therefore so was the music. Throughout these journal entries from Clancy, there's so many other parts to them in my opinion, which sound like they are talking about music and the industry coinciding with this theory. So let me talk about those. In the first entry, he talks about pondering what type of impression he wants to make, which I believe makes sense with pondering what direction the music should go in. And he talks about an obstruction that he had never noticed, which I personally think is him trying to make the music he genuinely wants to make, even if some people won't like it. The third Clancy entry in particular, I read as the industry shaping the music that is being made and how people making genuine music for money and similar themes to that. Honestly, it makes total sense that these are topics being brought up with Clancy, whereas for Tyler's experience with Dima, it's a personal emotional experience. Especially during the hiatus, Clancy was like a way to peek into Tyler's mind for what's to come and how he felt creating the music, which was represented also through Ned, and since Ned represents the creative process in this era, it just is fitting that Clancy could represent the music. Anyways, I'm gonna go back to what I was talking about. So to start out, Clancy talks about a light, a glow being dark and lifeless and dreamless, basically which makes sense to me with uninspired and genuine music being made for other priorities and reasons such as money, as I said previously. He says that many others think that this sentence is normalcy, so if my theory is right, other musical artists. And basically that they reverse and erase the hopes and dreams that they came with, which I think, if my theory is right, once again, to make good works of art and not give them to a meaningless robotic structure, or should I say an iron order, and that they were basically lied to. Or this the meaning if my theory is correct. Still don't know what the fuck vitalism is, so I'm gonna skip over that. This one's one of the bigger lines for me. We used to close our eyes and picture a better life. Now the city is full of dry eyes, caught in a trance of obedience, devoid of any trace of an identity. Once again, I'm gonna say what I think this would mean if my theory is correct. I would translate this to, we used to want to make music for the genuine reason of making it, finding joy in that, but now we're all just making music for the reason of making money off of it. Now, of course, there's some other ways to read this line, and a lot of the other lines, these entries as well, but particularly with Clancy talking about his identity, version of himself, etc., I feel confident that this is talking about how the music is. In the final entry that I want to talk about, Clancy says some things about Dima that I find particularly interesting. In this particular section, he's saying similar things to what he said before in the other entries, that they're asleep and think they know the truth, continuing with the same meaningless tasks. So this story, regardless of what the story specifically means and who the characters represent, the basis of the story is basically what's truly good. So it's basically this place seems good, but is it truly good, and which one's truly the bad one sort of thing. And then he says that this isn't about in there, it's about out here. So basically it isn't about Dima, it's about Trench, more so implying that the good of Trench outweighs the good of Dima. So he starts off saying that's real, which goes perfectly with the idea of making genuine music no matter the outcome of its reception. And then it talks about how it would rather take hardship than to live a life that someone else created for him, which I think goes perfectly with the music theory once again, possibly talking about the artists who don't even write their own songs, in any case are living a life created and morphed by the people listening, since they are making the songs for them in order to make money. So to summarize my theory, I think that Clancy represents the boys' music. And proof for this goes for Clancy saying that's his 9th year, and it was the 9th year 21 Pilots music at the time. Also that when he left the Towers of Silence, the boys' silence ended. And beyond the play on words just simply from the name The Place, I think that there was a reason that Clancy leaving ended the hiatus. It's because the music left the silence basically. And the final, more broad yet just as valid point is that a lot of parts of Clancy's journal entries sound like they were talking about music in the industry, all of which I point out in this video. But some of the main ones were, I've heard stories about the idea of home, and its depictions always seem warm from the storyteller's description, with the storytelling seemingly related to lyrics in my opinion, with Clancy caring about lyrics which makes sense with 21 Pilots music. But it's real and it's true, and I'd much rather endure reality than to be mindlessly obedient to a life that someone else created for me, which I think talks about making genuine music. And finally, this hope discovery alone has birthed a new version of myself, which I think fits quite well with this meaning that their music changed. So I think that this theory makes sense for so many reasons in regard to the Demorg site. And when I came up with this theory, I was mind-blowing myself to be honest, because I felt like I had finally pieced together Clancy's entries and what I felt connected them together, even with how cryptic they are. This is of course just a theory and not fact, so I'd like to know what you guys think.